Hey everyone, it's Samuel, and welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons & Dragons. Today in the Prime Material, the Advantage Mechanic. In the Wilds, the Cadaver Collector. And in the Tavern, what would you do if you ran out of work? Hey there, everybody. I hope you all enjoyed our foray into a little bit of a different format last week. Special thanks to Ben, David, Star, Jared, and Lex for joining me for the Travel Roundtable. Everyone seemed to really enjoy it, and we'll have to make sure to do another roundtable in the future. Thank you so much for your feedback. For today, we're celebrating our 25th episode by getting a little technical and diving into the advantage-disadvantage mechanic for Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition. Before we get into all of that, just a few announcements to get out of the way. Remember to follow us on all our social media. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Subscribe to us on YouTube, if that would be your preferred way of listening to the podcast. And wherever you listen to the podcast, we would genuinely appreciate a rating. It helps spread the word about Plot Hooks to more and more people. Finally, it would be awesome of you to support us on Patreon. There's lots of awesome perks up there for our patrons, like all the homebrew information for our setting of Carrick, including supplements like the Ichmaset race, the deities of Carrick, the document that describes what sets that setting apart from others in Dungeons & Dragons. And of course, coming up soon, we'll be releasing some stat blocks for a few monsters, animals, and NPCs that you can use in your own campaigns. So there's lots up there on Patreon. We would genuinely appreciate your support. It helps us make the podcast better each and every day. But with that out of the way, the advantage mechanic. This particular Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition mechanic is very well designed. It's clean, it's simple, it's easy to understand, so much so that despite it being such a key rule to the entire game, it doesn't even need that much time in the player's handbook to explain it because it's just that simple. But the question that we want to explore today is, are there times when this great mechanic might need to be changed a bit in our games? And if so, when, why, and how? So we want to dive into the nitty-gritty of what makes advantage and disadvantage work and how it plays out in our narratives. So real briefly, the mechanic is this. Certain factors in-game can either aid in your chance of success at a task that requires a D20 roll, or there can be factors that make the task harder. If a task is easier, you could receive advantage on the roll. That means instead of rolling one d20 and living with the result, you instead roll two d20s and you take the higher roll. Conversely, if the difficulty of the task imposes disadvantage on you, you roll two d20s and use whatever the lower of the two rolls is. Now, if multiple different in-game factors are giving you advantage on the attack or check or what have you, you still only roll one additional dice. Even if you have advantage from 5 different factors, you still only roll 2 d20s and take the higher. The same goes for disadvantage. I imagine this was designed in this manner, in large part just to make this key mechanic simpler. Similarly, if you have different factors that are giving you both disadvantage and advantage at the same time, they cancel each other out. You just roll a single d20 and take the result. And again, I imagine to simplify, no matter how many effects are giving you advantage or disadvantage, if you have both, it's just a single straight roll. You could have advantage from 3 different factors and disadvantage from 2, but you don't get advantage because you have more advantages than disadvantages. Just if there's any combination of both advantage and disadvantage, it's still just one roll. And that's pretty much the entire mechanic. What you end up with is this very clean, simple feature where if you have any number of advantages, roll 2d20 and take the higher. If you have any number of disadvantages, roll 2d20 and take the lower. And if you have any number of both, they just cancel each other out and you're back to a single roll like any normal circumstance. Personally, I think this mechanic is excellent. Having such a quick and simple mechanic for such a key part of the game is great. Otherwise, everything is just flat modifiers, and you have to remember what the bonus is to your roll for every single circumstance that could affect your d20. Are you behind cover? We'll add this preset number. Are you attacking a creature that is prone from a distance? Oh, we'll subtract this different set number. And it's just stacking upon stacking of different flat modifiers, and it's just very difficult and very clunky. But just this clean, simple advantage-disadvantage mechanic is just a great way to do that. However, there are some problems that are inherent with the advantage system. And anytime you have such a clean, wonderful mechanic in a TTRPG system, there's going to be those things, because no matter how specific you get in a rule set, you cannot possibly, no matter what you try to do, you cannot possibly ever cover each eventuality in a full sandbox role-playing game where literally everything is possible. And the problem that this particular mechanic has is that the effect is always the same. You always roll a d20 and get advantage or disadvantage. There's certain actions that are treated as equivalently difficult when in real life they're not. Let's take an attack roll against a creature. In one situation, you're making a ranged attack on this creature while it's prone. According to the rules, you have disadvantage. That's because you're attacking a creature that is on the ground from a distance and you have less of a target to hit. Your modifiers are still the same and everything, you just have disadvantage. You roll 2d20 and you take the lower. Well, you take another situation, and let's say that you've just been blinded by this creature on its turn, and now you go to make an attack against it just by judging where it is by the sounds and where you saw it last. By the rules, the same effect applies. You have disadvantage on that attack. A third situation, that creature went invisible on its last turn. And now you're trying to attack it. And that attack, again, by the rules, has disadvantage. In all of these situations, attacking a prone creature from a distance, attacking a creature while you are blinded, or attacking a creature while it's invisible, they all impose the same restriction on you. They're all treated the same. It's just disadvantage. The thing is that these are not exactly equivalent tasks. It's far easier, at least in my opinion, to hit a creature on the ground than to make a successful attack while blinded. And yet, all of these have the same mechanical effect. Disadvantage. Let's take the reverse situation. An attack roll when you have advantage. Some of the things that grant you advantage are if the creature you're attacking is blinded, if the creature you're attacking is unconscious, if the creature you're attacking is stunned, if the creature has been affected by a guiding bolt spell, lighting it up with divine energy and guiding the next attack. All of these circumstances grant advantage on the strike. And the same concern can be levied here, because these aren't necessarily equivalent tasks. Attacking a blinded creature, however easy, is not as easy as attacking an unmoving, incapacitated, unconscious being on the ground. So this is a little bit of the trade-off for having a very clean and simple mechanic like this, is occasionally you'll run across situations where things are treated equally when they're not. The question is this a problem? Is this something we should be concerned about? Really, the feel-bads, if they happen at all, are extremely few and far between. Is there anything that we as DMs should do to change the balance? Anything we should consider as a house rule? Personally, in my opinion, I think it's rarely necessary to do anything different. I think it just doesn't happen enough, and I really like the clarity and the simplicity of the system. But there are very occasional times when I do like to do something a little extra than just what rules as written allows. And I think all of us as DMs do this to some minor extent, or some to an even much larger extent. And I want to explore some of these possibilities about ways you could alter certain circumstances if you find it fitting at your table and if your players find it enjoyable. So there are two broad categories to changes that we can make as DMs. One is the house rule. Something that is determined from session 0, that this is just the way this is going to work in this campaign. The other is a spontaneous ruling, where something happens in the moment and you just feel that a further advantage or disadvantage is warranted than perhaps rules as written allows. The other is a spontaneous ruling, where something happens in the moment and you just feel that a further advantage or disadvantage is warranted than perhaps rules as written allows. So those are the two types of changes we can make as DMs. Now what we want to do is we want to dive into different mechanical ways we could alter advantage or disadvantage if we feel that it is warranted in a particular situation. And then we'll talk about if those can be done as either house rules or as a spontaneous ruling or both. So the first thing that we can change for disadvantage or advantage is by adding or subtracting a set number to a roll. And there are already some effects that do this, where instead of giving a bonus or a detraction through advantage or disadvantage, the bonus is given through a different method. The spell Pass Without a Trace is well known because it helps you be more stealthy, but it does not grant advantage on stealth. Instead, it gives you a static plus 10 to whatever your stealth roll is. Not only is this more powerful than basic advantage, it also stacks on top of advantages. Another example is cover. If a creature takes cover, it's harder to hit. But trying to attack a creature behind cover does not give you disadvantage, it just raises their AC. If the targeted creature has half cover, they get +2 to that armor class, and if it's 3/4 cover, they get +5. So there are effects in Dungeons & Dragons which grant bonuses or detractions that aren't advantage-based. So there is precedent here for adding or subtracting a set number to a roll. But you might say, how would we know what number to add or subtract? And when would we do this? Well, hold on to your butts, because we're about to get statistics-y. To discover what numbers we can add, we have to know what we're already getting with advantage or disadvantage. With the average D20 roll, where you just roll one dice, your average is 10.5. Statistically, when you roll at advantage or disadvantage, it alters that average roll by a little over 3, specifically 3.325. So your average roll at advantage is 13.825, and your average roll at disadvantage is 7.175. So just rounding, when your average normal roll is 10.5, you're going to roll on average a little over a 7 on disadvantage and a little under a 14 at advantage. So one option that you have, if you're in a situation where a player has superior advantage, where you look at the situation, you're like, they have advantage, but really they should get more than just advantage here, you can have them roll at normal advantage and then add an additional 3 to the roll. Whether that's mentally adding a 3 in your head so that you determine if it hits a creature's armor class, or subtracting 3 from the DC that you had in your head as you were doing a check. However you want to do it, you can alter the number that they need to hit by 3. Same thing applies if they're trying to do a task which is just exceptionally hard. In addition to rolling at disadvantage, you can add an additional 3 to that DC, or an additional 3 to that armor class, just to make it just that much harder. But in reality, this number could be even higher than 3 if you wanted it to be. Because, again, going back to statistics here, the D20 system does not care about averages. It cares about hitting a target number. Because your percentage chance of success is connected far more closely to what you need to roll as your target number than whatever your average roll is. Let's explain that a little bit. Let's say you're trying to make an attack roll against a creature with an armor class of 16, and you have a +5 modifier to hit. This is a simple illustration because that means you're exactly 50% to succeed on a straight roll with no advantage or disadvantage. You have a +5 modifier, which means that 50% of the time you're going to roll an 11 or higher, 11 to 20. Even at that lowest number, 11, your +5 modifier is going to get you to that armor class of 16. So the target number you're trying to hit with this particular roll is an 11 on your dice. And you will hit that 50% of the time. 50% of the time you'll roll an 11 or higher, and 50% of the time you'll roll a 1 to 10 and you won't succeed. And with this midline example, the difference between advantage and disadvantage is staggering, because statistically, percentage-wise, gaining advantage here boosts your chance of success all the way to 75% instead of 50%. And disadvantage, conversely, makes you only 25% to succeed. You're changing your chances of success by 25%. And this is not statistically equivalent to a +3 static bonus like you get if you just look at your average roll when you're rolling with advantage. It's actually equivalent statistically to a +5 static bonus. The Player's Handbook actually hints at this as well, because in the rules about passive checks, if the DM determines silently that a player would have advantage on the check, they are told to simply add 5 to their passive skill score. But getting back to statistics again, that percentage change of success or failure is not static. You're 75% to make a roll at advantage if what you need to roll on the dice is an 11, and 25% at disadvantage if what you need to roll is an 11. But if your target roll varies from this baseline, your percentage increase or decrease changes. And this makes sense if we think about it. If all you need to do is roll a 2 on your dice, then really advantage isn't going to make you much more likely to succeed, because you were already extremely likely to succeed anyway. Conversely, if you have to roll a natural 20 to succeed, yeah, advantage is going to take your chance of success and nearly double it, but it's still so unlikely that the percentage change is only equal to about 4.5% or so. So in reality, the bonus equivalent of advantage or disadvantage changes based on the number that you want to hit. The bonus equivalent is roughly equal to 5 if you want to roll an 8 to 14 on your dice. And it decreases to 4, to 3, to 2, and then all the way out to the statistical equivalent of just a plus or minus 1 towards the extremes. Essentially, the more towards the extremes that the roll you need to hit on your d20 is, the less advantage or disadvantage matters. Generally, you don't need to alter anything anywhere near the extremes as a dungeon master, because if the task is already so hard, why bother figuring out exactly how to make it just a little bit harder by adding something to disadvantage? Or if the task is already very easy, why bother trying to make it even easier by adding something to the advantage? You would really only ever need to do something further past advantage or disadvantage if you're towards that middle of the spectrum. I know that's a lot of numbers and complicated statistics, but all of this is essentially to give you a statistical basis to say this. If you as a DM are in a situation where you want to make something easier or harder, past just the baseline advantage or disadvantage, you can, in your head, add or subtract somewhere between 3 to 5 to the target number. This is a statistically valid option. Say there's an unconscious creature on the ground, and your entire party is around it, and your barbarian is raging and making their attacks at advantage, and they make them reckless, so they have advantage because the creature's unconscious and advantage because they're attacking recklessly, and they're right next to the creature when they're prone. They just have advantage all over the place, and you want to give them an extra boost than just rolling at advantage. We'll tell them to roll at advantage and add 4 or 5 or 3 or whatever number you would like. Tell them to add an additional number to that roll to give them a higher chance of success. And there's lots of different ways that you can do that as a dungeon master. Now, in terms of pros and cons of this particular method, we got to go back to the 2 broad categories of ways that we can implement changes, where you can either do it spontaneously or with predetermined house rules. This particular method, I think, works really well with house rules, where, for instance, going back to the unconscious creature example, if you're going to hit an unconscious creature with a melee attack and you think it's just should be easier than just granting advantage, then just make the rule at the start of your campaign that any strike in this situation gets an additional +5 to hit on top of the advantage. You can determine ahead of time in your game that you're going to have a house rule that hitting an invisible creature should be harder than just disadvantage, and say that it's going to give an additional +5 to the creature's AC if you're trying to attack a creature that's invisible, on top of the disadvantage that you already suffer. You can look at a particular character's background and their familiarity with a certain thing, like a druid with an intense love of a certain kind of plant, and you just rule that whenever this character makes a nature check regarding these particular types of plants, not only do they get advantage, but they just get an additional +5 bonus because of how knowledgeable they are on the subject. So this type of thing works really well for just rules that you set up ahead of time. I don't think this works good for spontaneous changes. Determining a number in your head and doing that math in your head really fast is just really difficult whenever, as a DM, you already have so much stuff on you. Not only that, but my personal philosophy with spontaneous changes is that if I'm going to make an adjustment in the moment, then I don't do it in my own favor. I only do it in the player's favor, as a general rule. I don't want to implement any spontaneous changes to the rules as written that's going to give my players further disadvantage or give me more advantage, because I just don't like doing it in my own favor. I don't want the players to feel like they've gotten gypped by me going past the rules to do something that harms the party. I just think that would be unfair. So unless it's a house rule that's been agreed upon beforehand, I just don't do that in my games. I don't want to harm the trust that's between me and my party. But I will give further benefits to my party occasionally if the moment warranted it. But with just this numerical value of just spontaneously deciding to add 3 or 4 or something like that, that's really hard to do in the moment. I think that doing this sort of thing works really good if you're going to house rule a specific situation. So that's the first thing. Adding or subtracting a set number to the advantage or disadvantage roll. The second thing is to give super advantage or super disadvantage. And this is the same concept as adding or subtracting a set number to the roll. Only instead of adding the 3 to 5 that's essentially equivalent to another advantage, you're literally just rolling another dice. Instead of rolling 2d20 and taking the higher or lower, you roll 3d20 and you take the highest or the lowest. You get a similar statistical advantage with this as with your average roll situation because you're adding another d20. It's not quite as potent. It's a little bit less than the 3.325 increase that you get from your first additional d20, so not quite as potent, but it's a similar concept. Personally, I think this is the best method. If you are in a situation where you think something is really easy or really hard, but not so easy or so hard that you want to just describe what happens, that you think there actually is a decent enough chance that it could happen, where a failure or a success could occur whenever the opposite is expected, the simplest thing is to just have them roll 3d20s. There's no specific modifier to remember. You can house rule this just as easy as you can house rule a +5 modifier in a specific situation. And this also works really well as a spontaneous rule, where all of a sudden you're just in this situation you'd never thought of before, and you just feel like giving super advantage, as I call it, is just warranted in this situation. And you just look at the player and you said, you know what, go ahead and roll 3d20. The only real con that I can think of for doing it in this method is doing super disadvantage rolls. It feels really bad when you're just rolling at normal disadvantage and your first roll is really good and you can't take it. It feels that much worse if you have 3 d20 and your first rolls are like 18, and then your third roll is a 2. It feels so bad. But there are certain circumstances where that method may be warranted. So we have adding or subtracting a set number to the roll. We have giving super advantage or super disadvantage. A third thing that we can do is to let advantages or disadvantages stack. And this just means tracking in a particular situation how many times you have advantage and how many times you have disadvantage, and just letting each one of those factors giving you an additional dice with no canceling out at all. So let's say you're in the situation we keep going back to where you're attacking an unconscious creature and you're in melee with it. All right, well, you have advantage because the creature's unconscious. You have advantage because the creature is prone and you're making a melee attack. If you're a barbarian attacking recklessly, you have a third advantage. And so because of all of that, you would then roll 3 additional d20s on top of your straight roll because you have 3 advantages. And if you're not allowing things to cancel out, then advantages and disadvantages don't cancel out each other either. In that same situation where you have 3 different advantages, well, what happens if that barbarian is also poisoned at this particular time? That means that they have disadvantage on their attack roll. Under normal circumstances, it would just be a straight roll because both disadvantage and advantage exist. But here, there's one condition of disadvantage and 3 conditions of advantage. That means one of the advantages cancels out the disadvantage, and you're left with 2 advantages. So in this particular circumstance, you would roll your normal d20 and 2 additional d20s because of the 2 non-canceled out advantages that you have. The problem with this particular method, and the reason why I really do not like it, is it's super hard to track. You have to pause at every moment and count up exactly what factors are playing into each scenario, and it just becomes clunky and difficult, and like I said, hard to track. It's really hard for me to even track how I just described how exactly it would work. But it is an option, and if you do really love rolling lots of dice, well, you're going to get to roll a lot of dice with that particular method. The last thing that you can do would be to add a different dice to a roll. So not a d20. This would be essentially making a bless or a bane spell just exist on a particular action. If you're unfamiliar, bless or bane are spells which are opposites of one another, where creatures affected with bless get to add a d4 to their attacks and saving throws, and creatures affected by bane have to subtract a d4 from their attacks or saving throws. And you could do the same thing, sort of going back to the first method that we talked about, where you're just adding or subtracting a set number. Here you're adding or subtracting a set dice. You can just house rule that in this particular situation, you're going to get to add a d4 or a d6, or you're going to have to subtract a d4 or a d6 from your advantage or disadvantage roll. This does have a benefit of being more variant than just a static +5 or +4 number that you're giving to it, but personally it's not quite as clean. So if I'm going to add something to a roll on top of advantage or disadvantage, I'm just going to do a set number rather than a dice. The one exception to that could be if you're doing it spontaneously. Again, as we mentioned before, adding a static number is hard to do spontaneously, but adding a different dice is not hard to do spontaneously. You can just, as a DM, essentially be the bard giving out inspiration dice to the party whenever you feel that it's warranted. So those are the 4 things that you can do to adjust advantage or disadvantage if you like to. They're just small things you can do in the situations where you feel like advantage or disadvantage is not quite enough for a given situation. But ultimately, again, I want to reiterate, the advantage system is excellent, and I don't think it needs to be changed. There's just certain small moments that we've all encountered as a DM where it just feels like advantage or disadvantage is just not quite enough for a particular scenario. Personally, what I like to do is just that second option, super advantage or super disadvantage. It's just simple and easy and can be done on the fly. But what do you think? Are there times whenever you change advantage or disadvantage at your table? Do you think it's just not worth it to worry about? How would you handle these particular scenarios? We'd be interested to hear from you on all of our social media. But I think for now it's about time to leave our statistics at our desk here and go outside into the wilderness and look at the cadaver collector? Alright, we're out here in the wilds. Today, we're going to look at the Cadaver Collector. You can find this in Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes on page 122. And this thing is creepy. This is a construct, originally a denizen of the outer plane of Acheron, where they wander around collecting cadavers and sticking them and the armor of the particular corpses that they come across all across their body. But occasionally, there are people which might summon these particular entities to the prime material plane. And when they are, they can be quite fearsome and terrifying creatures to encounter. They are a challenge rating of 14 with quite a lot of immunities. They're immune to the conditions of charmed, exhausted, frightened, paralyzed, petrified, and poisoned, and they're immune to necrotic, poison, and psychic damage, as well as non-magical, non-adamantine attacks with physical weapons. They have magic resistance, gaining advantage on saving throws against spells or other spell effects. They don't require food or water, they're just constructs. They have a multi-attack of 2 slam attacks, as well as a recharging, paralyzing breath gas attack, where they force everything in a 30-foot cone to make a DC 18 Constitution saving throw or become paralyzed for a full minute, or until it makes a successful saving throw, which it gets to make at the end of each of its turns. But really what makes these creatures so terrifying is the fact that they literally just collect cadavers. They are quite literally what their name suggests. They only respond to the summons of somebody in the prime material if they're called to the scene of a great battle, whether it's one that's actively going on, or whether or not one is about to happen, or if one has taken place. They will come to these areas, and again, they'll just start shoving pieces of armor and weapons all inside and on top of themselves, and they'll impale corpses all over themselves with all the stuff that's salvaged from the battlefield around them. And interestingly, if the cadaver collector actually happens to slay creatures itself, then it can attach them to itself and actually enslave the spirit of that particular entity. It then gains the ability as a bonus action to summon 1d6 specters without the sunlight sensitivity clause that fight for it until they're destroyed or the cadaver collector dies. And it can do this particular ability once per rest. And that is a really powerful and terrifying ability. Just imagine as a party coming across this particular entity full of spikes and lances and swords and bits of armor jutting out of it and just body parts stuck all over it, and all of a sudden it just starts pulling the souls of these particular entities and just placing them in front of you just so that you have to fight them as well as it as it's going around, while it's trying to slay you and add you to its collection and breathe its paralyzing breath and put you on lockdown so it can impale you later. It is a terrifying and really cool creature for an encounter. These things are great to use if you're coming across an ancient battle site. It could even be in a ruin or something that is really old and the cadaver collector appears to be inactive, but when the party gets there, all of a sudden the presence of new life, the possibility of new corpses to collect suddenly reactivate it, and it goes into action to try to destroy the party. But whether you're doing it that way, or you just happen to be coming across it on a particular battlefield, they're great creatures to really pound home the reality of the terribleness of war to your party. It's hard in role-playing games to really get that across sometimes, because we're in battle almost every session. We become numb to it a little bit. And sometimes we need a little jolt to remember that we are playing in this world and what we're seeing is terrible. War is terrible. Death is terrible. And here we see this machine just literally taking advantage of the cruelty that humanoids have imposed on one another. it can not only be a great encounter in terms of a combat encounter that they actually fight, but it can keep going. If done right, it can be a situation that keeps the party talking and really starts the moral conversations about the particular situations that they're encountering. One final way I think you can use this quite effectively is by playing up the fact that somebody had to actually summon it here from Acheron. If this was something that just occurred, if you're talking about a battle that is currently raging, well, perhaps they have to track down where this cadaver collector came from. Perhaps it's a leader of one of the two armies that are fighting. And maybe this cadaver collector got out of control and now it's laying waste to a vulnerable nearby town. Again, with these types of situations, you can play up the realities of war and the true atrocity that it is. But I think that's about enough time on this bloody battlefield. Let's head back to the tavern and get some refreshment. Right, we're out here in the tavern. No more icky blood or cadaver collectors. Just today's plot hook, which is, what would you do if you ran out of work? Now, this sounds like the antithesis of what you want to do as a DM. You don't want your party to run out of work. But if it's used right, this can actually be a really interesting hook. Imagine this situation. Your party is part of an adventuring guild. They've been accepting tasks and going out to slay monsters or find items or explore ruins or what have you. And now all of a sudden, there's no work. They come back for a new contract and there's nothing there. And this could be done for any sort of circumstance where the party was expecting to gain a contract, whether that be an underworld organization or a bounty hunters guild. No matter what, they could feasibly come back to a place where they're expecting to pick up some work and there is none. And the question you have to answer as a DM then is why? What happened? Why is there no work? Because that is a problem that they then have to solve. Perhaps there's been a big crackdown or a high-profile arrest that has disrupted this criminal's underworld that they were a part of. And they have to then decide whether they're just going to let that be or they're going to try to break this person out and return to the status quo or what they're going to do. If they're part of that adventuring guild, then maybe some terrifying creatures have actually been preventing contracts from actually reaching the headquarters, and they have to figure out how to get the contracts flowing in again. It's one of those hooks which is really interesting to me because your party is going to a particular situation looking to get something, and they do get something, but it's not exactly what they expected. They expected a contract where, regardless of what they were going to have to do, they were going to go accomplish the goal and come back. And now they have to figure out some other scenario to get back to that status quo. And there's so many different ways you could do this. Heck, you could even have it as a confrontation with a particular rival adventuring group. Maybe they came back to the adventuring guild and there was no work for them because all their contracts had been taken and already succeeded by this upstart group. And now they have to deal with this rival adventuring party. Don't just assume that if your players are going somewhere for work, that you have to give them a contract. It may be that the story would be best served by putting them in the situation where they've run out of work and they have to figure out a way to get that flow going again. But I think that'll just about wrap up this week's episode of Plot Hooks. I want to thank all of you out there for listening. Please go check out our Patreon and support the show. Interact with us on all our social media. And above all, thanks for listening. From all of us here on the Plot Hooks team, I'm Samuel, and thanks from Matt, Mike, Steve, Dave, Zach, Becca, and of course, podcast Pupper Ellie. We'll see you all again next week for another episode of Plot Hooks.